By determinism, we mean that you come in sick, and I say which part's wrong. I give you a drug, stick it in your body, and all of a sudden you feel all better again because we can predict the outcome through a process called determinism. And that leads us to this understanding. This is from Judy Olafson's book called Mother's Little Helpers. This picture here shows the Valium bottle sitting right there, the proverbial Mother's Little Helper. And the relevance about it is this. As you notice, every 15 minutes on television, there's ads from the drug companies. And not only are they telling you now that they can fix parts of you, arthritis, pains, and aches, but they also say, hey, you having a bad day? You're having a tough time? You got a little anxiety? We got pills for you. And the issue is very important here is because the whole aspect of medical research is based on the drive by the drug company. It's the drug company that profits from the research because then when we understand how things work, they make the parts and then you buy the parts. Except sometimes there's a lot of errors in that. And I'll give you a big one that's affecting the population right now. There was a study done in North Carolina, and it revealed that more than 50% of the children taking Ritalin for attention deficit disorder don't have attention deficit disorder. I mean, in other words, we're overprescribing the drugs. And the problem is it's not the drugs that are the answers to the issues and that we have to look for another answer. So we get out from this drug model. So I have to explain to you how cells work. And this is the beautiful part because it's not very complex. The complexity comes in the number of pieces. And the pieces that I'm going to talk about are the proteins. That you have approximately 100,000 protein parts that make up your body. And these are just like machine parts. And the reality is that these 100,000 parts work together and carry out the life functions. They don't look like the machines that we're used to. They have weird looking shapes to them. They look organic. Of course they're organic parts. They're amorphic looking. They don't look like sheet metal and screws and nuts and bolts. They look like things like this. Now, at the top of the picture in white is an AIDS virus. At the bottom of the picture in white is the surface of a human cell. That the blue structure is a protein attached to the AIDS virus, and the red structure is a protein that's on the surface of every one of your cells. And the idea is that the virus cannot attach to your cells unless the blue protein of the virus complements and plugs in like a lock and key to the red protein on your cell. Now, when you look at this little bubbly looking protein, you might think, well, that's just this little organic chewing gum kind of thing or something. But the truth is this. These are as accurate as machine parts as any human machines we've ever made. That the fact is that this same red protein is the very same on every one of your cells, because if it wasn't, you wouldn't be able to be affected by the AIDS virus. So my point is for you to recognize that machines don't always look like the machines that we see, but they have an organic look to them. This is another organic machine. There you can see a helix. The yellow and the magenta is a DNA double helix. But in purple and blue and green and orange, that's a protein machine. Again, you look at it and you say, well, that's a machine? And the answer is yes. It actually screws down the length of the DNA, and at the front where the arrow is, that protein machine adds new pieces to the DNA to extend the length of the DNA. So my point again is, look at this, but recognize these organic things are actually machines. So here's a picture of a protein on the left and a picture of the protein on the right. It's the same protein. And the point about it is this. Underneath the structure of a protein is a backbone. The backbone gives the shape to the protein. Remember when we were young and you went into school and your teacher said, draw a person. What kind of person did you actually draw? A stick figure, right? With the backbone and the shape. That's what gave the shape. And then when you got older, you fleshed out the stick figure. Well, the point about it is this. The protein on the right is the stick figure, and the one on the left is the fleshed out version of the same thing. So underneath, there are these backbones. So here's the interesting fact. There are 100,000 different proteins, and all proteins are the same in this regard. All proteins are like beaded strings. The beads are amino acids. So when you go to the health food store and you hear about amino acids, what are they? They're the building blocks of the beads. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids that make up the beads. So what is different between 100,000 different proteins? And the answer is this. The length of the chain and the sequence of the beads. The sequence of the beads give the shape. Well, you say, well, where can you get some shape out of this? It looks like spaghetti. There's no shape in this. And the answer is, well, the beads actually have a little bit more rigid structure. So what I'm going to use are these pipe fittings that are going to represent 3 different kinds of amino acids just by the colors. So instead of 20, I'm only going to show you 3. And what they look like are actually, if you look at the backbone there, they actually look like these pipe fittings. And the reality is this. The amino acids plug in together like that. And when they plug in together, you can start to assemble them. And actually, it's still a chain, isn't it? If you think about it, it's just a sequence. But now, instead of being flexible, now you begin to see that there's a very specific shape that's occurring here when I start to assemble them. So as I start to assemble my protein, all of a sudden you see the backbone starts to acquire a three-dimensional shape. So do you see the three-dimensional shape? Say yeah. I thought you'd see it. And the reality is this. If you see it, compare it to the shape back there. You see the similarity and the colors? And the fact is this, that the protein backbone are these amino acids. And if I change the sequence that I put this together with, I won't get the same structure. So the point is this. Each protein is different because each protein has a pattern that is determined by the sequence of the subunits that are making them all come together, so that a protein has that particular structure to it. It's just like a backbone like in you. Your shape is determined by your backbone. And so the fact is this, where you have vertebral bones, the protein has these amino acid subunits. And the reality is this, but you also can change your shape. As you bend and twist your backbone, then the truth is proteins do the same thing. Proteins are like miniature people in that regard. So instead of looking at a machine like this, the metal machine that we're used to, imagine if I replaced the gears with proteins. Okay, now we have a protein watch. But the bottom line is this, let's get rid of all the metal. And now you're saying, what? Well, what is this? A collection of protein. It's not a collection of protein, it's an interaction. It's like gears. That these protein machines actually start to work together to do what? Digestion, respiration, muscle contraction. All these are machine-like elements. In fact, I could take the proteins out of your body, put them in a test tube, and carry out the same functions. I can do digestion in a test tube. I can do muscle contraction in a test tube. The point is this. Your body cells are made out of these interesting protein parts. And now let me just talk about the fact is that, remember I showed you there's a backbone version like on the left side of the screen, and then there's a fleshed out version on the right side. It's the same protein. The yellow is an antigen, like a virus. The blue is a protein called an antibody. What I want you to notice is, you see how the shape of the protein and the antigen are complementary? What happens if I would come up here and take out that yellow antigen? What would be left on the surface of the protein? A pocket, a cleft. What would fit back into that shape? The same thing that I pulled out of it. In other words, the shape is so specific that protein surfaces have pockets and clefts, and other things plug into them. And I'll give you one more example of that. Here's an enzyme in blue, and then there's a chemical group that plugs in right in there. And look at the shape of the pocket and the chemical group. Why am I bringing this up? And the answer is this. Proteins bind to things in the environment, and they bind with a very high specificity because of the shape. And let me give you an example of this. And let me show you, actually, this is the interesting part. Let me show you where life comes from. You can see it right in this little model. It's going to work like this. First thing before I do this, I'm going to say this. The two amino acids in yellow, let's say they're negatively charged, okay? You know what like charges repel each other and opposite charges attract? Are you familiar with that? So the question is this. I'm going to show you two shapes, and then you tell me which is stable. Shape 1 is this one. See the shape? Okay, shape 2 is this one. Which is more stable, 1 or 2? 2, because the opposite, these like charges want to get far away as they can from each other. So I say, I showed you that the protein has two shapes, but right now I'm going to say that this is the preferred shape of the protein. Why? Because the two like charges are as far apart as they can. Now a drug, a chemical, or a hormone comes into the environment, just like that antigen in the antibody, and it plugs in. And I'm going to call this a signal now. Now let's say the signal, because the signal is going to be positive, and this is negative, what's going to happen when this comes by? It's going to attract it. Now it binds it, right? Now the question is this. What charge is at the end of this chain, positive or negative? What charge is at the end of this one? Now the question is this more stable or is this one more stable? Okay, so what did you now just think of the logic, what you just said. You showed me two different shapes for the same protein, right? And what's the difference? And why does it have two shapes? Because if I take away the charge, let's say I take away this drug, what's the protein going to do? It's going to go back to this one, right? This is movement, right? Did it go from 1 to 2? Did it move? Movement is the source of life. It's just the only molecules that move. Proteins move. Life comes from moving proteins. When I make the protein as it moves do work, then behavior comes from the movement of protein. So basically the question is this, where does life come from? And the answer is, first from the structure. The proteins provide for the structure of the body, but then the proteins are capable of changing their shape. Changing shape is called conformation changing. As illustrated right here on this picture, there's a protein, and this is right out of the Science Journal, so it's not my pipe fittings, this is the molecular model that's in the journal, and you can see the protein in green on the left this is the protein that causes muscles to contract. It's the switch, it's like an on-off switch. In the green form, the muscles don't contract. But when I add a signal, which is that white dot, it's calcium. When the calcium plugs into the molecule, it's exactly the same as the signal plugging into my protein. It changes the electrical charge. And when the charge changes on the protein, it changes its shape. So I go from conformation 1 to conformation 2. But what if I take the signal away? Well, when I take the signal away, as you saw, the protein will reset back into the original conformation. So the point is this. A protein exists and it will not move until what happens? What is the event that causes the protein to move? The signal. So the signal, when it shows up, causes the protein to make work. So the fact is the body coordinates the functions of the system by controlling the signals to the proteins, which then control their movement, and that movement is generated into functional things like breathing and digesting and moving and excreting waste matter. It's all through these functions of the protein. So the conclusion is simple. Proteins change shape, that results in movement, and the movement is harnessed by the cell to do work and behavior. So that proteins give you not only your physical structure, proteins also provide for your function. So when you look in the mirror and you look at your identity and your character, you're really looking at the proteins that are giving you the shape. But you also recognize this, that you can change your shape and you can change your movement because proteins also move and change their shape. So that the bottom line of life comes from protein movement. That's the truth. If you stop protein movement, life stops right at that point. And proteins are the only molecules that are moving, so they become the most important ones in the generation of life. So if I have a test tube on the left side, I put all the proteins of the cell, and I have a cell on the right side with all the proteins in it, so the proteins are exactly the same in the left and right, the test tube is not alive, but the cell is alive. And yet it has the same protein. So the question now is, what is the difference between the two? And the answer is simply this. The cell has control. The test tube, all the proteins are just working randomly. There's no order, no organization, no orientation. They're just making a gamish, and they're all moving around, but they don't lead to a direction of life. To have life, I have to control the protein's functions. Then I have control. And the question is, so what controls life? Now here's an assumption, and this is where it all went wrong. It goes like this. Protein parts are like parts in a car. When you drive your car, after a while, the parts wear out. Let's say you're driving along and your tire wears out and it goes flat. What happens to your driving then? It stops. Okay, if you wanted to start again, what must you do first? Replace the tire. Okay, here's the point. Proteins wear out. In fact, every day you're losing cells and proteins by trillions of cells, and tons of proteins are getting lost because you're using them. So we have to replace the proteins. So the scientists sat back and they said, what's the simplest way to control biology? And the answer is this. If I have a function and the proteins are making the function, and a protein in that function wears out, what happens to the function? Okay, if I want to have that function again, what must I do? Replace the protein. So the scientists sat back and said, well, that's the simplest and easiest way to control biology. If we can find what replaces the protein, then we will find what controls the cell. So the bottom line is they started off already with an idea that was first grounded in the science in 1859 by Charles Darwin, because he said this. He said that the traits and characters and behavior of an individual are due to hereditary factors. We didn't know back in 1859 what those hereditary factors are, but by 1953, this is what we found. They were looking for the hereditary factor because they said the hereditary factor controls the protein. So the belief is this, that the pattern of the protein, the beads, you know, the colors of the beads that I'm showing you here, are built into the patterns of the subunits on the DNA helix, those little things, the rungs of the ladder. And that these DNA codes for this. And the relevance of why DNA would be the hereditary material is because DNA doesn't wear out. DNA doesn't break down. In fact, you can find fossils, like 50,000-year-old fossils, and take DNA out of the fossils and put them in a test tube and make proteins using the DNA as a By determinism, we mean that you come in sick, and I say which part's wrong. I give you a drug, stick it in your body, and all of a sudden you feel all better again because we can predict the outcome through a process called determinism. And that leads us to this understanding. This is from Judy Olafson's book called Mother's Little Helpers. This picture here shows the Valium bottle sitting right there, the proverbial Mother's Little Helper. And the relevance about it is this. As you notice, every 15 minutes on television, there's ads from the drug companies. And not only are they telling you now that they can fix parts of you, arthritis, pains, and aches, but they also say, hey, you having a bad day? You're having a tough time? You got a little anxiety? We got pills for you. And the issue is very important here is because the whole aspect of medical research is based on the drive by the drug company. It's the drug company that profits from the research because then when we understand how things work, they make the parts and then you buy the parts. Drugs. And the problem is it's not the drugs that are the answers to the issues and that we have to look for another answer. So we get out from this drug model. So I have to explain to you how cells work. And this is the beautiful part because it's not very complex. The complexity comes in the number of pieces. And the pieces that I'm going to talk about are the proteins. Except sometimes there's a lot of errors in that. And I'll give you a big one that's affecting the population right now. There was a study done in North Carolina, and it revealed that more than 50% of the children taking Ritalin for attention deficit disorder don't have attention deficit disorder. I mean, in other words, we're overprescribing the drug.